The reality is that Britain is being asked to embark on a war without agreement in any of the international bodies of which we are a leading partner.
From the very moment that he stood up, you could sense a change in the atmosphere. People were hanging on every word.
We cannot now pretend that getting a second resolution was of no importance.
Like a martial artist, he was using his opponent's strength against them.
Then for this House to stop the commitment of troops in a war which has neither international agreement nor domestic support.
You know, it was a moment that carried enormous significance, authority and emotion.
It is for that reason, and that reason alone, and with a heavy heart, that I've resigned from the government.
The year is 2003. Britain is preparing to go to war with Iraq as an ally of the United States. Robin Cook is considering his options of whether to stay in government and deciding ultimately that he's unable to stay in the absence of a UN Security Council resolution authorising war. The speech for me really started when I happened to bump into Robin Cook at a reception in Westminster, actually just literally a stone's throw from where I'm standing now, and this would have been in January 2003. I'd worked with him at the Foreign Office until 2001. So I obviously knew him very well. I'd worked for him for a total of 7 years in opposition and then in government. We bumped into each other at this reception, and it was pretty clear from what he was telling me that he was uneasy about the rush to war with Iraq, which was at that moment gathering pace. I made an appointment to see him in February of the following month. I went for a drink with him in the evening at his private residence, and it was there that he confided to me his intention to resign from the government if the government had failed to secure a Security Council resolution authorising war with Iraq, and the government was determined to go to war with Iraq anyway. And really, he was sounding me out about my willingness to help him with that process, which I agreed to do in principle instantly.
Mr. Speaker, this is the first time for 20 years I have addressed the House from the backbenches. I must confess I had forgotten how much better the view is from up here. None of those 20 years were more enjoyable or more rewarding than the past two, in which I have had the immense privilege of serving this House as the leader of the House. Made all the more enjoyable, Mr. Speaker, by the opportunity of working closely with yourself. It was frequently the necessity for me as leader of the House to talk my way out of accusations that a statement had been preceded by a press interview. On this occasion, I can say with complete confidence that no press interview has been given before this statement. I have chosen to address the House first on why I cannot support a war without international agreement or domestic support.
The speech is interesting. You'll see when you watch it that it begins and it ends with a reference to him as a parliamentarian. He starts the speech by saying that it's the first time in 20 years that he was addressing the House from the back benches. He'd been on the front bench in opposition and in government at that point. And he makes a remark about the view being better from the back benches. And he pitches it really as a way of saying, you know, I'm one of you, really. We're all parliamentarians on the same level. Ultimately, we all derive our mandate in the same way from the British public. Parliament was his natural habitat as a politician.
The reality is that Britain is being asked to embark on a war without agreement in any of the international bodies of which we are a leading partner. Not NATO, not the European Union, and now not the Security Council. To end up in such diplomatic weakness is a serious reverse. Only a year ago, we and the United States were part of a coalition against terrorism, which was wider and more diverse than I would ever imagine would be possible. History will be astonished at the diplomatic miscalculations that led so quickly to the disintegration of that powerful coalition.
Well, Robin's approach to writing speeches was always to ask me to do a draft first, but I was experienced enough in doing this to know that, you know, he would only ever use that as a jumping off point for something that he would write almost entirely for himself. He would sometimes take the ideas, he would sometimes, you know, riff off things that I'd put down, but he was enormously proud of his own words, and it wasn't really because he was, conceited. He didn't like the line to take culture. in politics. He felt that it was inauthentic, and he felt that the public could see through politicians who were simply reading someone else's script. So he took great care on occasions like this to make sure that he wrote the words himself, and the end product was a speech which, apart from one line which remained from my original draft several days earlier, it was entirely his own thoughts and words.
Do you remember what the line was?
The line that survived was really a thought which I think is still with us now and still relevant now, actually. And it was that the idea that the West had to go to war with Iraq now because Saddam Hussein had for, I think, 12 years by that point ignored UN Security Council resolutions, had to be set aside the fact that Israel for many, many years longer than that had been ignoring UN Security Council resolutions on the occupation of the West Bank.
I've heard it said that Iraq has not had months but 12 years in which to complete disarmament, and our patience is exhausted. Yet it is over 30 years since Resolution 242 called on Israel to withdraw from the occupied territories. We do not express the same impatience with the persistent refusal of Israel to comply. I welcome the strong personal commitment the Prime Minister has given to Middle East peace. But Britain's positive role in the Middle East does not redress the strong sense of injustice throughout the Muslim world at what they see as one rule for the allies of the US and another rule for the rest.
And I was sat, if you look at the film footage of it, up to the right of where he was sitting at that time. And from the very moment that he stood up, you could sense a change in the atmosphere. There was a hush of a noise. The usual hubbub that you find in Parliament completely died out. People were hanging on every word that he made very, very intensely. And you could see from Robin's body language, and you could tell from his voice, you could really feel the emotion of the occasion from his point of view. And that conveyed itself to the people who were listening. It was a moment that carried enormous significance, authority, and emotion.
None of us can predict the death toll of civilians from the forthcoming bombardment of Iraq. But the US warning of a bombing campaign that will shock and awe makes it likely that casualties will be numbered at least in the thousands. I am confident that British servicemen and British servicewomen will acquit themselves with professionalism and with courage. I hope that they all come back.
It's remembered, I think, because it was considered to be an act of self-sacrifice on a point of principle, and those things are fairly rare, actually. People often resign for reasons of thwarted ambition or because they've been driven out on the heels of a scandal. Not many politicians nowadays resign simply on a point of principle because they feel that they can't accept the constraints of collective government responsibility anymore.
I applaud the heroic efforts the Prime Minister has made in trying to secure a second resolution. I do not think anybody could have done better than the Foreign Secretary in working to get support for a second resolution within the Security Council. But the very intensity of those attempts underlines how important it was to succeed. Now that those attempts have failed, we cannot now pretend that getting a second resolution was of no importance.
And one of the most important parts of the speech is where he builds up Tony Blair and Jack Straw and praises them for the efforts that they've made in trying to secure a second Security Council resolution to authorise war. And I think at one point he says nobody could have done better than the Foreign Secretary, who, let's face it, had succeeded Robin and replaced him. Nobody could have done better than the Foreign Secretary in trying to get that second resolution. But then he turns the point in typical Robin Cook style, and he says, but the very fact that you have failed and the fact that you put in so much effort means that you cannot now ignore the fact that the failure to get a resolution is a significant and damaging reality that Britain has to address diplomatically. I think that was an important moment, because it's like a martial artist. He was using his opponent's strength against them in that way. But it was a very familiar rhetorical device for anyone who had watched Robin's previous parliamentary performances.
From the start of the present crisis, as leader of this House, I've insisted on the right of this place to vote on whether Britain should go to war. It has been a favourite theme of commentators that this House no longer occupies a central role in British politics. Nothing could better demonstrate that they are wrong than for this House to stop the commitment of troops in a war which has neither international agreement nor domestic support. I intend to join those tomorrow night who vote against military action now. It is for that reason, and that reason alone, and with a heavy heart, that I've resigned from the government.
Right at the very end of the speech, you can hear in the sort of in the modulation of his voice, you can hear the emotion coming across. It was much more obvious to those of us who were sitting there and who witnessed it. You can still see it to some extent on the video, but it came across very clearly to those who were there. And of course that explains the extraordinary response in breach of parliamentary convention, whereby he got a standing ovation from a large number of members of parliament, because applause is obviously not allowed in the chamber normally, but on this occasion I think people just couldn't resist it.
Order. 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 Order.
It was the end of the speech is an extraordinarily emotional moment, really. It was double-edged, obviously. It was satisfying and uplifting to gain the plaudits of colleagues that he'd served with over many years. It was a very parliamentary occasion, and for him a very fitting way, therefore, for him to exit government. But he felt it as a failure. I mean, he felt the failure to stop the Iraq War as a personal failure that really troubled him greatly, and only troubled him more because of what then happened subsequently. The speech is remembered, I think, as a benchmark of integrity in politics. He is somebody who gave away the government job that he'd really worked for many, many years in opposition, because he felt that what the government was doing was wrong. I think it also altered our perceptions of the Iraq War and the aftermath. He didn't stop the war, but I think he removed the alibi of those who remained in government, that they had simply been misled by false intelligence into invading on a pretext that wasn't justified. Because what he said in that speech very clearly was that it was possible to read the same intelligence that Tony Blair and Jack Straw and the rest of the cabinet had read and come to the correct conclusion that Saddam Hussein didn't have weapons of mass destruction in the way that they were talking about, and that he didn't pose an immediate threat. Mainly I look back at Robin's legacy as a sort of collection of what-ifs. You know, if he hadn't died prematurely at the age of 59, 2 years later, I think he would still have had a significant amount to contribute to public life. He possibly may have returned to the government, although I think that's not certain, because he was enjoying life outside the cabinet by the time he passed away, very much, and he'd found a lot of personal happiness. But he may have returned to government in some role. I think he would have probably had a great influence on Labour as it went into opposition. I think he would have prevented it from making a lot of the mistakes that it's made in the last few years. I think he may even have been able to make a difference in the Brexit referendum in 2016. I think he would have been a very active participant in that, and possibly even among the main leaders of the Remain campaign. And maybe he, as somebody who'd resigned from government, would have been able to reach disaffected voters who felt that the Remain campaign at that time didn't really speak to them and didn't really motivate them. He would have found a way, I think, to have reached at least some of those disillusioned voters, and maybe in sufficient quantities to make a difference, but we'll never know.